Well, hello there, class. I want to welcome you to our Old Testament 101 class. Last week, we looked at the books of Genesis and Exodus. Within that, we talked about the creation and God's hand in creating everything that we have. We talked about a little bit of the fall and then the world spiraling out of control after Genesis 3. Then we talked about Genesis 12, that when we think about the story of the Bible, we have to stay focused on the blessing to Abraham, because the whole Bible evolves from the story of the Bible evolves from Genesis 12 onward. And in Genesis 12, God is going to bless Abraham and tell Abraham that he will be a blessing to the world. And we know that that blessing will come from the seed of Abraham through Jesus, who will end up blessing the world. And so anyhow, we talked about that. And of course, the promise to Abraham and the blessing that he would be to the world and his family. We begin to see Abraham's descendants, his son Isaac, and how God works in that. And from Isaac, we go to Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. And of course, as a family, they didn't do so well. But then we move into Exodus, where Israel has been in Egypt for a little over 400 years, and it's within the book of Exodus that God begins to start his process of building this nation. He first must bring them out of slavery because they are enslaved to the Egyptians. And so God takes them out of slavery, and they go into the wilderness, to where they are heading towards the land that God's going to show them, and they're going to be a blessing to the world through this. And so a lot of good stories within Exodus. We also receive God's commandments, especially we begin with the 10 commandments, or also known as the 10 words, and there are other instructions. So today we want to move into Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we will continue, God's going to continue to work with his people. He's going to give them instructions on how to live. And so we want to move into then the book of Leviticus. So Leviticus, in this book, we see that God's going to work through his people. He desires to have fellowship with Israel, his chosen people, his set aside people, this people that's going to bless the world. And so within Leviticus, we find that it provides and explains the laws that God's people need to follow to live in fellowship with God. And so the beautiful thing about God is that we don't have to make up things on how to live, but God has provided those things to us, and how we can live in fellowship with him. So in the last chapter of Exodus, it tells us about the building of the tabernacle. And so Leviticus begins with descriptions of the sacrifices to be performed in the tabernacle. And so, and it describes and explains how important these sacrifices are. Leviticus is the title of the third book of the Bible, and it literally means having to do with the Levites. So there's going to be a lot of instructions within the book of Leviticus to the Levites. The Levites are priests who are to serve the different tribes and to be a blessing to them. Later on, we're going to find out that the Levites are the only tribe that doesn't receive land. And the reason they don't receive land is that they are to serve the other tribes, and they will administer different functions within the community. They will work at the temple. They will seek to do all kinds of different things. But it's interesting because in Leviticus, or at least with the Levites, that in the New Testament, Peter, the Apostle Peter, tells us that we are to be a holy priesthood. And I think Peter had in mind this idea of the Levitical priest, and that they would be a servant to the nations. And so anyhow, Leviticus is having to do with the priest. As far as authorship, again, this is part of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And traditionally, those have been attributed to Moses. So Leviticus says 56 times that God gave these laws to Moses. And so we'll just say that Moses has written this along with the other 5 books of the law, or the Pentateuch. So when we're talking about purpose, themes, and structure, the purpose of Leviticus was to show the Israelites how they could both worship and to walk before God in purity. And this is important in the book of Leviticus. If you've ever tried to read through the Bible, a lot of times people will get stuck in Leviticus because it just seems like, wow, all these laws and things that the people would have to do. And we don't necessarily have to do all those today. And so people sometimes will get lost in the book of Leviticus, but it's actually an awesome book. And it's broken up into these 2 sections of how the Israelites can both worship and walk with God in a pure way. And we learn that God is a holy and pure God. And back in Exodus, if you remember reading about the golden calf, the Israelite people did not take God seriously. They didn't take him as a holy and pure God. And so we don't want to make that mistake either. The theme of Leviticus is holiness. It's a separation from impurity for the purposes of being used by God. And I think that's something that we can learn today, that we have, as God's people, have been set aside. And so to be a pure people, to be a blessing to the world. So the structure of Leviticus, as I've said, follows two kinds of holiness. There's first holiness in worship. And so when you read chapters 1 through 17 in Leviticus, there's sections in there teaches us about restoring fellowship with God as one comes to worship, instructs how to express gratitude to God through giving offerings, explains the laws the priests must have to follow to lead Israel in worship. And so there's a lot of details in this book. Tells about how to stay ritually clean so one can join in worship at the tabernacle. And also when one defiled themselves ritually, there were ways to clean, to go from unclean to clean. And so also describes the Day of Atonement. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Also tells us the right way to offer blood sacrifices and instructs Israel not to eat the blood of animal. And that becomes really important, especially for God's people, because the blood had life in it. And God took life very seriously. And if you were going to eat animals, you were not to drink the blood in it. That was, in some sense, that was sacred and holy. And so you would not eat the blood. So if the first part is about how to worship God in holy ways and how the priest did that, then the second part of the book of Leviticus is holiness in everyday life. And so it's in this section that we learn what God wants for sexual purity. And so there's all kinds of laws describing how one is to remain sexually pure. and also what happens when you don't. Also describes within these chapters other practical laws God wanted Israel to follow. Things including laws about farming, business, caring for the poor. The thing that I want you to know in Leviticus is that God did not leave his people without a way to live life. God's desire is for us to flourish. And so these laws were not meant to somehow make us stumble, or so that God could show us how much of a sinner we are, but they're really a protection, a hedge of how to live as a healthy people, a people that are flourishing. And so then we also have, what happens when somebody violates God's laws, and the punishments that go along with that. And it commands people to live, and the priest especially to live pure lives. Also describes the seriousness of the wickedness or sin, or the penalties. So there are times that we see in Leviticus that some things are just a ceremonial cleansing or an offering to be made, but there are some sins that were so wicked and it was so destructive to the community that God allowed for that person to be removed from the community, and sometimes even their very life taken. Now, we need to be careful, right? We want to interpret the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus. And so sometimes what happens is that when we're teaching in the Old Testament, we will use Old Testament laws and say, see, God wants to take a life. But remember, we know now in the New Testament that Jesus doesn't allow us to do that. But for that time in Israel's history, those were things that God had commanded. And so God promised that if they lived a certain way, there would be blessings. And also, if they didn't, there would be curses. So historical background. So Leviticus tells us about the month between the building of the wilderness tabernacle, right? That was the end of Exodus, and when Israel left Sinai. So that's just kind of the timetable here. As far as some messages, if you were to share or preach some messages of Leviticus will develop right between these two sections that we've talked about. First of all, how to stay in a right relationship with God through worship. And so we've talked about this. So that right relationship, some ways that you could preach this is how to approach God while, in fellowship with him. And so, in other words, what is it, those things as you're in fellowship with God and everything's going right, how you might do that. How to approach God when not in fellowship with him. In other words, in these chapters in Leviticus, chapters 4, 1 through 6, and chapter 6, God gives ways that when you sin, he gives ways to get back into fellowship. And then certainly the message as far as about purity, laws about national atonement, and the atonement was a day set aside once a year. The high priest would go into the holy place of the tabernacle there. And he was only allowed to do that once a year. And there were different restrictions and different things that he would have to do. What's important is that those sins that were not covered or sins that had not been forgiven, it would be on that day that those sins would be forgiven as the high priest went in. So the second part, as the message develops within the book of Leviticus and ways that you could teach or preach this, is that individuals who make up Israel are instructed to honor and obey God in their everyday lives. And so in this we have rules on sexual behavior between people. and rules on social behavior and how to be set apart before God. Again, I want to emphasize that these rules that God had given on sexual behavior or on social behavior, how to do different things, they were meant to protect the people, to help them flourish. So the theology of Leviticus is really just, it's a focus on holiness. How do you live a holy life? How can you be pure and clean before God? And so, there's some subpoints in that. Sacrifices could restore broken fellowship with God. And so we know as Christians that it's the sacrifice of Jesus now that restores that broken sacrifice. And so, but it was during those times, it was a way to help people find forgiveness, to get into a right relationship with God. Ultimately, a right relationship with God was through real faith and obedience. It's just some uniqueness and how to preach it in your church plant. Leviticus shows how important it is to keep your relationships right with God. And so I'm gonna not go through this chart here, but in your book, there's some ways that you can point to Jesus from the text in Leviticus. And so we'll let you look at that. So that is most of Leviticus here. Here's some outline of the book of Leviticus. And we've already talked about that, but this breaks it down more. And so we will finish with Leviticus, and we will start up here with the book of Numbers now. All right, now we will move on to Numbers, and so Numbers is a very interesting book in the Bible. And there's a lot that goes on in this book, and so really Numbers is what's interesting about Numbers is that it covers a lot of years. And so Numbers tells us about Israel's wilderness wanderings. So historically, right, they were in the wilderness almost 40 years. And so it's a major transition. There is two generations. There's one generation that was promised the promised land, but then they die in the wilderness because of their sin. And we'll talk about that in a moment here. Then there's a generation, their children, that they were children in our young children and young adults probably that came out of the Exodus, who now will grow up, and they will be the second generation, and they will be the generation that actually goes into the promised land, this land that God has promised his people. It's interesting, like Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers begins with the word and this shows that the first 4 books are connected. They're part of the story. The book of Numbers, it's called Numbers because there's a lot of numbers within it. There's a counting of statistics of the tribes and of the census that the leaders, the priests, and the Levites are to take. And Numbers is just that. There's a lot of different numbers because of all the listings. So we have said that within this book, or the first 5 books, that Moses is the author, and so we will just assume that he's the author of Numbers as well here. We'll look at the purpose, themes, and structure. The purpose of Numbers was to describe the change from Israel's old generation that left Egypt and sinned in the desert to the new generation that stands on the edge of the promised land. And if you remember the old generation, they had Joshua, or Moses had sent Joshua and Caleb along with 10 other spies to check the land, and only Joshua and Caleb came back with good reports. The other 10, they had no faith in what God was going to do, and so they end up they're going to be stuck in or die in the land. And so Numbers is going to record the success and failures of Israel according to their obedience and disobedience as they go through the land. The overall theme of Numbers is that God's people can go forward only as they trust God. And I think this is an important theme and something that we have to get out of Numbers. Success always depends on faithfulness to God. It's what took place in the garden, right? That God said, listen, trust me, don't touch this tree, and just be faithful to me. And they did not. We know what happened. And so we find in Numbers, this theme continues to appear, that when you're faithful and you trust God, you find blessings. When you don't, you find curses. And so that's what happens. Numbers, again, is structured around 2 census events. The first census begins with the story of the first generation of Israelites who would travel through the wilderness. This generation did not have enough faith, right, to enter the promised land. And we talked about that for just a moment already. The second census begins the story of the second generation of Israelites who traveled through the wilderness, and they would inherit the promised land. So a little bit on the historical background here. Numbers begins just 13 months after Israel's exodus from Egypt and ends almost 39 years later. So again, even though it's not a huge book, I mean, it's a decent sized book, but it just covers a lot of years. So Numbers tells us about Israel's journey from Mount Sinai. Remember, that's where they got the laws from God, and then through the wilderness and the plains of Moab, just outside the promised land. So developing the message of Numbers is developed through the 2 stories of 2 generations in Israel, which we want to keep that theme and understand that the first generation of Israelites was prepared to travel across the Sinai wilderness and enter the promised land, yet they don't because of their unfaithfulness and their rebellion to God. And so they will spend the next 40 years wandering. We also have in excuse me, in boy, trying to clear my throat here. We also have in Numbers, we have God providing for the people. We see that with the quail and manna and different things like that. So some of the theology of the book, while the book of Leviticus told us more about what the priests and Levites had to do to respect God's holiness, the book of Numbers tells us about what God expects from the additional people of Israel. Numbers shows that God is angry with anyone who approaches him with rebellion or immorality. So God also, through Numbers, also demonstrates how God provides his people's needs. And we've said that he provides guidance and protection. He instructs his people in his law. He provides and protects effective leaders for his people. So if you're going to preach, in your church plant, the book of Numbers says that God is holy and that it's very important to approach him in the right ways. Numbers offers a great opportunity to preach that God is still holy, but also opens the doors of how to share Christ as he fully met sacrificial requirements to gain our forgiveness. And so through Christ, we can approach God and have peace with him. So here's again the outline of the book of Numbers. And again, it's broken down into these 2 sections. The first generation fails, right? Because they were always complaining. God would provide, though. Israel refuses to enter into the promised land. That's where the spies went into the land, but they came back, gave bad reports, says, hey, we can't do it. So Israel rebels, and so Israel fails to honor God. And so that was that first generation. But the second generation, it's a different story. they're prepared to go into the promised land, but they're going to have to wait. So Israel's reorganized. And so there's instructions for conquering and settling the promised land. There's duties given, assemblies that take place, penalties, rules about the Sabbath year and Jubilee. And so a lot of different things within the book of Numbers. All right. So we have these two. Let's move to our last book, the book of Deuteronomy. So we now will we're going to move into our last book here, and again, that is the book of Deuteronomy. And so you should have that here on your screen now. So Deuteronomy is the fifth book. It's the final book of the Pentateuch, right? And it's also the fifth book of that Moses has written. Although at the end of Deuteronomy, it says Moses dies. And so most believe that obviously Moses didn't write that, but that an editor later on added that. So Deuteronomy records the last messages from Moses to the generation of Israelites who are about to cross into the promised land. Remember, we were saying that in Numbers, Numbers was a book about the two different generations, one generation that died in the wilderness, second generation that will enter into the promised land. And so Deuteronomy is a preparation really for this second generation to encourage them not to disobey God, but to be faithful to God. And so God has that generation that they had left 40 years ago. They had been in Egypt, and now they're getting ready to go into the promised land. And so Deuteronomy tells sort of a renewal of the covenant between God and his people. The name Deuteronomy literally means second law, but the book doesn't actually contain a second law per se, but we think that maybe it was used to explain or renew God's law to the second generation of people. And so again, we say that Moses wrote it, and so that's important. Deuteronomy, as along with the rest of the books of the law, were written somewhere around 1402 BC. So let's talk about purpose, themes, and structures. The purpose of Deuteronomy was to encourage God's people to make a fresh commitment to the Lord. The old generation had not stayed committed to the Lord. And so Deuteronomy is a way to say to this next generation, hey, your ancestors did not do well, but I want you to do well. And so the themes of Deuteronomy are expressed in three messages that Moses gives in this book. These are somewhat sermons. So the first is what God has done for Israel since they left Egypt. Secondly, what the covenant required. Second message is what the covenant required of Israel as they entered into the promised land. And then Moses's last message is Moses's encouragement to obey God and predictions about blessings and curses for Israel. And that really becomes important in the last couple chapters there of Deuteronomy. The structure of Deuteronomy follows that of a treaty between a lord or a king and his people. And this treaty structure was common in Moses' time, and it has 6 parts. There's the preamble or the introduction in chapter 1 in the first 5 verses. Then there's a history of the relationship between the parties of the treaty. So that goes from basically verse 5 of chapter 1 all the way to chapter 4, verse 43. Then there's a general call of faithfulness to the king, which would be a part of a treaty structure. And then there would be specific actions that will prove the people's faithfulness to this king. And we see that in Deuteronomy 12 and really chapters 12 through 26. And then the blessings and curses for obedience or disobedience to the treaty. And those are the last three chapters 27 through 30. And then the last chapter is the witness. And so that these have been witnessed. Historical background, we mentioned this, but Deuteronomy happened at the end of Israel's 40-year journey in the wilderness. So if you think about it, 38, 39 years is the book of Numbers. But for Deuteronomy, this might cover simply about 1 month of time as they sit there in the plain of Moab as they prepare to go into the promised land. So the development of the message, we've kind of picked up on this some already. Deuteronomy's structure follows that of a treaty, and its message is developed through the sermons Moses delivers. So the purpose of these messages is to encourage Israel to renew the covenant they made with God at Mount Sinai. So again, Moses begins with the history of God's faithfulness to Israel. Moses then tells about what Israel must do to show their commitment to their covenant. And then Moses tells Israel to renew their covenant with God, promising blessings for obedience to God and curses for disobedience. So the message of Deuteronomy is simply a preparation to make sure that they don't make the mistakes that were made from the previous generation. That as they go into this promised land, that if they want to be a blessing to their community and want to be a blessing to one another, and ultimately a blessing to the world, they just need to trust God. Of course, we're going to see in the books to come that doesn't happen. But anyways, at least for now, that's what they should be doing. So the structure of Deuteronomy is, again, like a typical agreement when we talk about what's going on. So in the theology for this book, the book of Deuteronomy teaches us that love and not legalism is the basis of the covenant between God and his people. God loves his people, so he wants them to be faithful. And so if they are faithful, this is what will happen. If they're not, then this will happen. If you were to preach the book of Deuteronomy, you would really want to emphasize the covenant part of this relationship between God and his people. And I think you would want to highlight how faithful God is to that covenant, right? He's going to provide and going to bless. And then also you would want to preach about how the people, that if they're faithful to God and that they love one another and serve God, that God's going to bless. And so obedience and disobedience are very important. And that'd be something big to share. So here's just an outline of the book of Deuteronomy. And we've talked a lot about this. There is a renewal because Deuteronomy, not that it's a second law that God's going to give, but it's sort of a renewal of the first law. Then it makes sense that the 10 Commandments are repeated again in the book of Deuteronomy. There's some laws about worship and holy life. And so it's really, a lot of it's just emphasizing what we learned back in Leviticus and Numbers. And so, but the key is that this new generation, they need to grow and they need to learn and know what God expects from them. And we also find at the end of Deuteronomy that Moses will die in the wilderness and not go into the promised land. And that was partly because of some sins of Moses. And so leadership will be handed over to Joshua. So that is the end of our lessons for today. But these are 3 books that really define what Israel is to be like and what's going to happen there. So look forward to seeing you in class. We'll talk to you later.